Hello everyone, this is Lee of CSI's NENM, and today I'll be explaining about what elasticity is in this chapter. So this is the table of contents of the topics and ideas that I'm going to be explaining, and let's get right into it. So why do we study about elasticity? So to give a fun example, I brought this photo. So I'm actually a fan of this K-pop group called NCT, and in this K-pop fandom, there is this, I guess, interesting trend where fans would trade photo cards from albums, and people would call for, hilarious prices. For example, this card right here, this is one of the most expensive cards, and people would call for really high prices, but people would still buy these photo cards even though the prices are really high. So I brought this example because I thought that this would be explaining what elasticity is. So elasticity is something that shows how sensitive consumers, in this case, and producers are to changes in price. So we'll get back to this later, but we can tell that fans are not sensitive to the changes in price for these photo cards, and we call that inelastic. We'll get back to that later. So the first concept I'm going to be explaining is elasticity of demand, which measures how consumers respond to changes in price. We can find elasticity of demand by using this price elasticity of demand, ED, and that is percentage of change in quantity demanded over percentage of change in price. So this might sound a bit confusing, but this is just a formula to determine the elasticity. Now, I've found many of my friends and other students learning microeconomics getting confused with this concept of percentage and its change. So I brought another formula which illustrates the percentage change in price or quantity demanded. So what we need to find is we just need to find the change, right? So in order to find that, we would want to subtract the initial value from the later value. So here I brought an example. So suppose the price of Coke decreased from $7 to $5, resulting in an increase of quantity demanded from 5 to 9. So in order to find the price elasticity of demand, what we want to find is the percentage of change, right? So to do that, we want to subtract the initial value. Let's do it first for the quantity demanded. So we want to subtract the initial value 5 from the later value 9 and divide that by the initial value and multiply that by 100 since we need to find the percentage. So, and we do the same thing for the percentage change in price. We want to subtract 7, which is the initial value, from 5, the later value, and divide that by 7, which is the initial value, and multiply that by 100, so we get the percentage. So I hope this kind of clears up what the percentage change means in the formula. And moving on, this is the elasticity coefficient value. So the values resulting from these formulas would equal to or would help us to determine what the value actually shows. And keep in mind that our values, our coefficient values, would always be the absolute value of our results. For example, if we got a number of -3 from this formula, keep in mind that we would always use +3, the absolute value of 3, not -3 itself. So keep this in mind, it is important for you guys to know and keep the chart in mind, and to briefly show this as a graph. If the demand is relatively elastic, the graph would be more horizontal. If demand is relatively inelastic, the demand curve would be more vertical. If it's perfectly elastic, it would be perfectly horizontal. If it's perfectly inelastic, it would be perfectly vertical. And moving on, explaining about total revenues and elasticity, they have a very close relationship. So as I made this graph, this graph is to explain the relationships between TR, which is total revenue, and elasticity. So as you can see, the green rectangles on both graphs show the initial total revenues, and the blue rectangles show what would happen to the total revenues if price went up. So note that I only drew the graphs or drew the rectangles for situations when price went up, and keep in mind that the opposite would happen when price goes down. So we can tell that if the demand is relatively inelastic, which means that the demand curve would be more vertical, the initial total revenue is smaller than the total revenue that is shown after price went up. So we can tell that as price increases, total revenue also increases, showing a direct relationship. The opposite happens when price decreases. Now, however, the demand is relatively elastic, which means that the demand curve would be more horizontal, the total revenue would decrease as price increases. And we can, just directly see that from the picture. We can tell that if in a relatively elastic situation, the green rectangle is bigger than the blue rectangle. So as price increases when relatively elastic, total revenue decreases, showing an inverse relationship. The same goes for when price decreases. So next we have elasticity along the demand curve. So this is just a simple photo showing the relationships of elasticity along the same demand curve. So the point where ED equals 1, which means price elasticity of demand, that would be our midpoint. And the left parts from the midpoint would mean that it is more elastic, and the bottom parts, well, the right part from the midpoint where ED is less than 1 would be where it's more inelastic in the same demand curve. Now we will be moving on to more types of elasticity that students would have to know to study microeconomics. So the first one I brought is the cross-price elasticity of demand. So this measures how sensitive consumer purchases of one product, let's name this good X or product X, are going to change in the price of some other product, hence good Y or product Y. So we measure the cross-price elasticity of demand using the cross-price elasticity coefficient, and we can calculate that by the formula shown on the screen: percentage in change quantity demanded of product X over percentage of change of price of product Y. So why is this important? Well, this is important since these coefficients can show us important facts on whether they're positive or negative. So when the coefficient is positive, product X and Y are substitutes. However, when the coefficient is negative, product X and Y are complements. So I guess all of you guys have already learned what substitutes and complements are in earlier chapters, so I won't be explaining deeply about what they are, but to give a brief example, when the coefficient is positive, that would mean that both the percentage of change of QD of product X and percentage of change in price of product Y would both be or both have the same sign, right? They would both be positive, positive, both be negative, negative. And that would mean that they have a substitute, the characteristics of substitutes. Since if the price of product Y goes up, the quantity demanded of product X would also lead to a positive number. So yes, and moving on, the second types of elasticity that you guys also should know about is the income elasticity of demand. So this measures how responsive consumer purchases are to income changes. And to measure this, we use the income elasticity coefficient. And we use the formula to find this coefficient, which is percentage of change in QD over percentage of change in consumer income. So this is all of these formulas are very straightforward, and I expect everyone to be memorizing these and feel comfortable in using all of these formulas. So this coefficient, the income elasticity coefficient, also holds important meaning to it, whether it's positive or negative. So when the coefficient is positive, the product of a normal good, the product is a normal good. When the coefficient is negative, the product is an inferior good. I also imagine all of you guys to be familiar with these types, with what a normal good and an inferior good is, so I will be moving on. And last, we have price elasticity of supply. So this measures the responsiveness of the quantity supplied when price changes. So in other words, it measures how sensitive producers are to a change in price. So note that before this, we have been learning about how consumers are sensitive to a change in price. But now we can see that we are going to be learning about how sensitive producers are to a change in price. So we also use the formula to calculate the price elasticity of supply, which is percentage of change in quantity supplied over percentage of change in price. And all of this is our graphs that we should be familiar since they're very similar to the price elasticity of demand curve. So when the supply is relatively inelastic, the graph would look more vertical. If the supply is relatively elastic, it would look more horizontal. If it's perfectly inelastic, it would behave as perfectly vertical. And if it's perfectly elastic, it would be perfectly horizontal. Now, to our final concept that we are going to be learning in this video, which is consumer and producer surplus. So this might kind of be off our topic of elasticity, but it is still a very important concept that everyone should be familiar and know. So let's get into it. Consumer surplus is the difference between the highest price a consumer would pay for product and the actual price paid. And the producer surplus is similar to that, is the difference between the lowest price a producer would sell and the actual price, the actual price received for the product. So this is a photo of the graph from the Barron's AP Economics textbook, and we can see that the consumer surplus is the point above our equilibrium, and the producer surplus is the bottom part. the lower part from the equilibrium, since we want to mark the difference between the prices. That's why we are shading the top triangles, the top part triangles, and the bottom part triangles. And adding the CS, the consumer surplus, and the PS, we would have a TS, the total surplus. However, there are situations where deadweight loss occurs, and also that results from price ceilings and price floors. So a binding price ceiling would be set below the equilibrium. So we can see from our first picture that the price ceiling, a binding price ceiling, is set below the initial equilibrium, and we can see that a binding price floor is set above the initial equilibrium. So they're just a price ceiling and a price floor are just methods for governments to help consumers and producers. So price ceilings are to protect the consumers, and price floors are to protect producers. So we can see in the picture when there is a binding price ceiling, deadweight loss occurs, and consumer surplus grows. More consumer surplus occurs relatively to a producer surplus. However, when there is a binding floor, there is also a deadweight loss, but producer surplus is bigger than the consumer surplus. So yes, so these were the important concepts of microeconomics, especially in this chapter of elasticity, taxation, and consumer choice. And thank you for listening, and hope you guys had a chance to understand these complicated concepts, and also further on study about these so you guys can feel more comfortable about them. Good luck.